making our way through How to Read a Book, the Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. Today we're going to finish Stage 2 of Analytical Reading. In my opinion, this is where things get interesting. Hi there, I'm Linda Maxey, the author of the Library Lynn Guides to Nonfiction Books and the author of an upcoming women's paranormal fiction novel. As I said in the introduction, we're going to finish Stage 2 of Analytical Reading today. So first a recap. Adler and Van Doren say there are 4 levels to reading. You start with elementary, then move up to inspectional, analytical, and syntopical. You have to master each bottom level to go up to each level above. For instance, it's not possible to do an adequate inspectional reading of a work unless you first mastered elementary skills. I have videos devoted to these first 2 levels. You can find them in the playlist, How to Read a Book. Analytical reading is where the rubber meets the road as far as truly understanding what an author is trying to say. The authors say there are 3 stages to analytical reading. I've already made 2 videos that cover the first stage of analytical reading and one that covers the first part of the second stage. The last one will be linked at the end of this video, and it covers the first rule of the second stage. Here are a list of the rules from stage 1. As you can see, these rules are to help you take the book as a whole and divide it into parts. The rules are, number 1, you must know what kind of book you are reading, and you should know this as early in the process as possible, preferably before you begin to read. Second rule, state the unity of the whole book in a single sentence, or at most a few sentences. Number 3, set forth the major parts of the book and show how these are organized into a whole by being ordered to one another and to the unity as a whole. And rule number 4, find out what the author's problems were. As you can see, all these rules are to help you take the book as a whole and divide it into its parts. In stage 2 of analytical reading, all the rules will combine to help you take those parts and interpret them so that you can understand the book as a whole. It's like taking it apart so that you can see the individual parts and then figuring out how to put them back together on your own. That sort of thing helps you understand anything. So here is Stage 2's first rule covered in the last video from the chapter Coming to Terms with an Author. Rule 5, find the important words and through them come to terms with the author. In that chapter, the authors tell you how to determine which terms the author uses that you need to define precisely as the author intends them to be understood. Please watch that video if you're curious about it. Now we're going to move on to the last part of this stage covered in Rules 6, 7, and 8. The title of this chapter is Chapter 9, Determining an Author's Message. In this lesson, they talk about how to isolate an author's proposals and arguments. To be clear, they're talking about expository works here, and as a review, an expository work is just one that sets forth to teach you something. These rules wouldn't apply to literature or to poetry, for instance. They're going to cover those in a later chapter. Now, they state here that all good books make proposals. A proposal is something an author wants you to understand. It's never okay to just read a book and grasp what the author wants you to understand at face value. They might be lying to you for one thing, or they might be lying to themselves. They may even be deluded. The only time it's okay to grasp what they're saying and just move on is if you're more interested in the author as a person than you are in what their book is saying. In that case, just be clear to yourself that that's what you're doing. You're not interested in their statements, and that way you don't have to act like you understand what they were saying if you really didn't. To get back to what they were saying, to make an argument, the author must make proposals that support that argument. You need to know what the proposals are and whether or not they support the argument the author is making. And proposals are made up of propositions. It's kind of like an old political candidate platform. You know, you don't hear it very often anymore, but they talked about candidates having a platform. And what they meant by that was that the entire platform is built on the candidate's stand on specific issues which make up planks in that platform. The book's arguments are sort of like this platform, but for the platform to stand firm, the planks have to be solid. If any one of the planks, in this case arguments, is rotten, the platform is not solid, and neither is the book's message. Your job is to examine the arguments for rotten places. That would be holes in the arguments, faulty information, faulty logic, that sort of thing. In other words, bad propositions. Once you've accomplished this, you can confidently interpret what the author is saying. This is not as complicated as it sounds. Honestly, this is the first chapter in the book that I grasped easily, and I also kind of found it a joy to read. This just made sense to me. So let's get into how to accomplish this stage. First off, we'll start with sentences and paragraphs. They make a big deal in this part about how to examine sentences for arguments. They use the example of a sentence they use a lot: reading is learning. A simple sentence that seems to make one argument. This is where coming to terms in the last lesson is relevant. It is an argument, but what do they mean by learning? That's a term. Do they mean gaining information, or do they mean gaining understanding? Those are two different things, and you need to use context clues and perhaps a dictionary to help you understand exactly which meaning they are trying to convey. They go on to point out that several arguments can also be made in a single sentence. They give here the example from Machiavelli's The Prince. Here he says, "A prince ought to inspire fear in such a way that, if he does not win love, he avoids hatred, because he can endure very well being feared whilst he is not hated, which will always be as long as he abstains from the property of his citizens and from their women." That is just one sentence. It's a very long one, but it is just one sentence. So in this sentence, three different arguments are made, or three different propositions are made. Number one, a prince should inspire fear. Number two, a prince should avoid hatred. And number three, the way to avoid hatred is to refrain from messing with the citizen's property or women. So individual sentences should be scrutinized if they seem important. Most sentences are not this important. Some are examples, asides, extra information, and so on, and you can confidently breeze right on through those, especially if you understand what they're saying. Next, they move on to discuss paragraphs. They say it would be nice if all arguments were stated as a single paragraph, but that's not the way most people write. In some fields like math and science writing, it can be a convention, but these conventions aren't always followed. And in a lot of writing, it's not expected at all. In other words, you can't count on authors to make the placement of arguments and propositions easy and convenient for you. So with that in mind, here are the next two rules in this lesson. Rule number 6, mark the most important sentences in a book and discover the propositions they contain. And rule number 7, locate or construct the basic arguments in the book by finding them in the connection of sentences. So let's look at Rule 6 first. How do you find the most important sentences in a book? Well, first, you find sentences that aren't really clear to you. It really doesn't matter whether the sentence is important to the author or not. If the meaning isn't clear to you, then you need to stop and examine it until you are clear on what it means. You need to be alert to do this. If you're reading like you're half asleep, you may breeze by a sentence and not be even aware that you didn't understand it. This, they say, is on you. They give another bracing pep talk here on active reading, requiring awareness and engagement. Now, that's from a reader's perspective. You also need to be reading for sentences that are important to the author. How do you know they're important to the author? Watch for ways that an author may emphasize sentences. In this book, they italicize sentences that are important. This is of tremendous help to the reader. The author may start to discuss the terms used. That's a clue. The author may spend time arguing with what another writer has said. That's another big clue. Anytime the author seems to be spending a lot of time discussing one thing, you can suspect it's important to the proposition. They say this is really not all that hard, and I agree with them. If you're paying attention, especially to the things you don't understand, it shouldn't be hard to find the author's propositions and arguments. So they divide Rule 6 into two parts. Number 1, locate the leading sentences, and number 2, discover the proposition or propositions that the sentence contains. How do you know you've grasped the proposition the author is making? You should be able to say it in your own words. This doesn't mean changing a few words around and being satisfied with it, of course. You have to be able to change the sentence completely in a way that makes sense and conveys the same meaning. And next, See if you can give examples from your own experience that illustrates that proposition. For example, when I talked about the propositions and arguments being like a political platform earlier in this video, that's what I was doing. I was using the platform as a metaphor for what Adler and Van Doren were trying to get across. They didn't use that metaphor. I came up with it myself. If you can do that, they say you have successfully grasped the author's proposition. Now on to the arguments. Rule 7. See if you can find paragraphs that pull propositions together to make arguments. They say this sometimes happens if the author is a good writer and is genuinely trying to be helpful. But this isn't always the case, of course. Sometimes the reader is forced to construct the arguments in their own words from propositions that have been scattered across paragraphs in the text. To quote them exactly, your task is to construct them by taking a sentence from this paragraph and one from that until you have gathered together the sequence of sentences that state the propositions that compose the argument. You have two ways of doing this. First, you can write down the propositions and arguments in a notebook, or you can do it the way I usually do it. You can just jot down the number of propositions as they're made, and then in the margins, jot down what the argument those propositions support. And another option is to underline the argument if you can find it. Then they go on to make some points about good books that relate to this. One is that good books summarize themselves as they make arguments. So you might hear something like, so as we have seen, A and B are true, so we can therefore conclude C, that sort of thing. Some authors, using good practice, summarize what they have said thus far at the end of sections or chapters. They point out that if you did a good inspectional reading before you read, you would know if the author has done these things, and you can use them to help you in constructing their arguments. They spend some time talking about other mistakes that authors can make. Sometimes they omit steps in making their arguments. If steps are omitted because they're supplied by common sense, then that's okay. They give the example of the statement, the whole is greater than the parts. If that's something they want you to understand, that's a common sense saying that most people grasp and don't need to have spelled out. But they say propagandists and other people with less than honorable intentions will leave out things that need to be said. They hope the omission will not be noticed and construct their arguments around partial truths. It's always a good idea to be watchful for these. When people make honest arguments, they conclude information that may refute their argument, and then they confront that information openly. Not long ago, I saw a couple of distinguished gentlemen having a conversation on a YouTube channel discussing population decline in America. They were deploring the fact that young adults were having less children. They made the point that jobs are plentiful, especially, they said, in the hospitality sector. What they omitted was that these jobs often don't pay well and that housing prices are higher, even adjusted for inflation, than they used to be. Add to that the high price of childcare, and you can see that the situation is more complicated than the arguments they were making. They seem to be saying that young adults are too scared or too lazy to have children. But back to Adler and Van Doren. They say well-constructed arguments can always be stated in a nutshell. And I like that bit of homespun wisdom. Moving on to the 8th rule of analytical reading, they tied together the first and second stages. Rule number 8. Find out what the author's solutions are. Up until now, you've been finding or constructing the author's arguments. With the arguments, you know what the author is hoping to solve. Now you need to discover how they solve it. It's possible some problems were solved and some are not, and that's okay as long as you're clear on which is which. You also want to make sure the author acknowledged the problems that haven't been solved. Once you've done this, you can be confident you understand what the author has to say. And that's a relief, right? In the next video, we'll talk about whether or not you agree with the author. In that one, we'll take a look at Chapter 10, Criticizing a Book Fairly. So that's it for today. Are you confident about your ability to read analytically? I have to confess that I've never really understood this process. In fairness to me, I've never been trained. I've never been taught how. We tore articles apart like this in graduate school, but I've never learned to do it with a book. Let me know your thoughts below. For great nonfiction books to practice your analytical reading skills, check out my books, Library Lens Curated Collection of Superlative Nonfiction, where you'll find books on every topic, and Library Lens Biographies, Autobiographies, and Memoirs, where you'll find interesting books about people. And until next time, Happy reading.